The sun had barely begun to rise when Ronald James parked his old, battered sedan in the far corner of the Oxbridge Academy parking lot. It was the same spot he always chose, a little out of the way, as if he didn't want to draw attention to the peeling paint and the dented bumper of his car. It was a vehicle that had seen better days, but it was still running, somehow, day after day. As the engine sputtered one final time and died, Ronald sighed deeply, his fingers gripping the steering wheel for a moment longer. Another day, he thought to himself. Another chance to make ends meet. He grabbed his thermos from the passenger seat, giving the dashboard a gentle pat, almost as if he were thanking the car for holding on just a little longer. Ronald had become accustomed to the clunks and groans of his old sedan. It wasn't much, but it had gotten him through more than a few rough patches. With a grunt, he pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool morning air. The world was still quiet, with only the faint chirp of birds and the distant rumble of a delivery truck to break the silence. It was early, too early for most people to be up and about. Oxbridge Academy, an institution that hummed with the activity of hundreds of students and staff, was still coming to life. Ronald liked it that way. The calm of the morning gave him a moment to center himself before the chaos of the day began. There was something peaceful about the quiet halls, the stillness of the empty classrooms, and the soft whir of his cleaning cart as he wheeled it through the corridors. The academy was a grand building, with old stone walls and gleaming floors, but it wasn't the grandeur of the place that made Ronald proud. It was the fact that it was his responsibility to keep it looking its best, to make sure everything was in order. He knew most people didn't pay attention to the details, but that didn't matter to him. For Ronald, it wasn't about recognition. It was about doing the job right, making sure everything was as it should be. Every classroom, every hallway, every trash can he approached. He did so with the same quiet dedication. Ronald was one of those people who took pride in the little things, in the work that no one noticed. He made sure that the floors gleamed under the overhead lights, that the desks were polished, and that every corner was free from dust. These small acts of care were his way of contributing to the school, of making sure that everyone else could focus on their work without having to worry about the state of their surroundings. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. And that's how Ronald liked it. To the students, he was simply Mr. James, the janitor who always had a warm smile and a kind word ready. He wasn't one to shout or demand attention, but he knew the names of the students, their favorite sports, even their little quirks. "Good morning, Marcus. How's that science project coming along?" he would say as he passed by. Or, "Hey, Jenny, I saw that goal you scored yesterday. Impressive." These small exchanges, these moments of connection, were what kept him going. They were the reminder that even in a job that often felt invisible, he was making a difference in his own quiet way. Ronald had never been one for accolades. He didn't need the praise or the spotlight. His reward came from the satisfaction of a job well done, from the knowledge that his work helped others. It was these small acts of kindness and the steady rhythm of his days that made life feel worthwhile. Even when his body ached from hours of scrubbing and mopping, he pushed through, knowing that the day would eventually end and the next would begin. It was the quiet, unremarkable pace of his life that brought him peace. But outside these walls, life wasn't always as polished as the floors he scrubbed every morning. Ronald's life had been filled with hardships, each one more difficult than the last. He had grown up in a small Florida town, where opportunities were few and far between. Life was a struggle from the beginning, with little hope for escape. But Ronald had always been a hard worker, always ready to do whatever it took to get by. His first job had been at a local fast food restaurant when he was just a teenager, and he had never stopped working since. The hardest blow of his life had come 10 years ago, when he lost his wife to cancer. The pain of losing her was something Ronald still couldn't put into words. She had been his rock, his partner in everything. They had dreamed together, planned together, built a life together. And then, just like that, she was gone. It was a loss that changed everything, that shook him to his core. Suddenly, Ronald was forced to become both mother and father to their 2 children, a responsibility he had never expected to take on alone. He didn't have the luxury of grief. He had to keep going for them. He had to keep providing, keep caring, keep pushing forward. His life became a balancing act between being a parent, a provider, and a caretaker. He worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. He sacrificed his own comfort, his own dreams, so that his children could have a better life. The old sedan was a constant reminder of those sacrifices. Its engine sputtered more often than it purred, and every commute was a gamble. Some mornings, the car refused to start altogether, forcing Ronald to rely on a patchwork of borrowed rides or long, tiring walks. But no matter how difficult the day was, Ronald never let it dampen his spirit. He just kept going, one day at a time, telling himself that it would get better. Despite the hardships, Ronald never lost sight of what mattered most. His children were his world. Everything he did, every sacrifice he made, was for them. He dreamed of seeing them succeed in ways he never could. He wanted them to have a better life, to have opportunities he had never had. It was a dream that kept him going, even on the hardest of days. Every time he saw his son and daughter laugh, every time he saw them make progress in school or take pride in something they had accomplished, it reminded him that his struggles were not in vain. Unbeknownst to Ronald, his quiet resilience and unwavering kindness had not gone unnoticed. One student in particular, Barron Trump, had been paying close attention to him. Barron was not the most outgoing of students. He was reserved, a little shy, but always polite. He blended into the background of the school, not because he wanted to, but because he preferred to observe rather than participate in the usual chatter. He didn't care much for the gossip about the latest trends or the endless discussions about family vacations and fancy cars. What interested him more were the small, subtle things, the details that others missed. Barron had always been observant, keenly aware of the people around him. He noticed their actions more than their words, and he often found that the things people did told him more about them than anything they could say. And it was during one of these quiet moments of observation that Barron first noticed Ronald James. To most of the students at Oxbridge, Ronald was just a background figure. He was the janitor, the guy who made sure the floors were clean and the trash was taken out. But to Barron, Ronald stood out. He saw the way Ronald always greeted everyone with a smile, even when it was clear he was tired. He noticed the care with which Ronald did his work, the meticulousness with which he polished floors and wiped down desks. But what struck Barron the most was the way Ronald worked when no one was looking, the moments when he thought no one was paying attention. There was one particular instance that stuck with Barron. He had been standing near the lockers one afternoon, waiting for his ride, when he saw Ronald hunched over the hood of his car in the parking lot. Tools were spread out on the ground, and smoke was rising faintly from the engine. Ronald was working tirelessly, sleeves rolled up and hands smeared with grease as he tried to fix his car. Barron stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. The sight stayed with him. It wasn't just the fact that Ronald was working on a car that barely ran. It was the sheer determination in his actions. Even as the Florida sun beat down on him, Ronald kept working, not asking for help, not complaining, just getting the job done. It was that quiet resilience that left an impression on Barron, and from that moment on, he began to pay more attention to Ronald. Barron had no idea how much his observations were about to change both of their lives. Barron Trump wasn't like most of the students at Oxbridge Academy. While many of his peers filled their time with the latest gossip about fashion trends, luxury vacations, or arguments over whose family owned the better car, Barron often found himself on the fringes of these conversations. He wasn't uninterested, not in the slightest. He was simply more thoughtful. His upbringing had taught him the importance of paying attention to people, not just to their words, but to their actions. He learned early on to observe the little things, to notice when someone was struggling or when someone was quietly making a difference, even if that person didn't ask for attention or recognition. Barron had always been a quiet observer, someone who preferred to sit back and watch the world around him unfold. He wasn't one to thrust himself into the spotlight or be the center of attention. He didn't care much about what other people thought about him, and as a result, he often found himself on the outside looking in. It wasn't that he didn't care about people, it was the opposite. He simply understood that not everyone sought recognition. Not everyone wanted to be in the center of conversations or surrounded by attention. Instead, Barron valued connection over visibility. He believed that everyone had a story worth knowing, that everyone's struggles and triumphs were significant, even if they weren't always noticed by the world. It was during these moments of quiet observation that Barron began to notice Ronald James. To most of the students at Oxbridge Academy, Ronald was just the janitor. He wasn't a teacher, he wasn't a coach, and he wasn't a staff member who interacted with students in any significant way. He was just the guy who came in early every morning to make sure the school was clean, to polish the floors and scrub the bathrooms, to fix anything that was broken. To many students, Ronald was little more than a background figure. He was always there, always working, always smiling, but he didn't draw attention to himself. That suited him just fine, as it allowed him to do his job without being bothered. But to Barron, Ronald was different. There was something about him that stood out. It wasn't just the way he did his job. It was the way he did it with such dedication, such care. Ronald wasn't a man who cut corners or rushed through his work. Whether it was wiping down desks or ensuring that every floor tile was polished to a shine, Ronald did everything with the same meticulous attention to detail. It was a quality that Barron appreciated deeply. It wasn't flashy or attention-grabbing, but it was something that made a lasting impact. At first, Barron didn't think much about Ronald. He simply noticed the man's quiet consistency, his unwavering commitment to his work. But as time went on, Barron began to realize that there was more to Ronald than just a man doing his job. He saw the kindness in his eyes, the warmth in his smile, and the genuine care he showed toward the students and staff. Even on days when he looked exhausted, when his body seemed to ache from hours of mopping and cleaning, Ronald always found the energy to offer a kind word, a smile, or a greeting. "Good morning, Marcus. How's that science project coming along?" he would say to one student. Or, "Hey, Jenny, I saw that goal you scored yesterday. Impressive," he would say to another. These small exchanges meant a lot to the students, even if they didn't fully understand how much they meant at the time. What struck Barron the most, though, was how Ronald's work extended beyond just cleaning. It was the little things that most people missed. Ronald would repair things before anyone even noticed they were broken. He'd replace a door handle that was loose or fix a broken locker before any students had even reported it. He did these things not for recognition, but because he understood that they mattered. He saw what needed to be done and did it, often without anyone asking him to. It was that kind of quiet, behind-the-scenes dedication that left a lasting impression on Barron. One afternoon, as Barron stood near the lockers, waiting for his ride after school, he saw Ronald once again working on his car in the parking lot. It wasn't the first time. Barron had seen Ronald there many mornings and afternoons, tinkering with the old sedan that he drove every day. The car was an old, beat-up vehicle, and it seemed as though it was on its last legs. The engine sputtered and coughed more than it purred, and every commute was a gamble. But Ronald kept at it, fixing what he could with the limited tools at his disposal, never asking for help. On this particular afternoon, Ronald was hunched over the hood of the car, his hands covered in grease as he tried to fix the engine. Barron watched as Ronald worked tirelessly, his sleeves rolled up and his face glistening with sweat from the heat of the Florida sun. There was no complaining, no frustration in his demeanor, just quiet determination. It struck Barron deeply. Here was a man who, despite all of the struggles he had faced in life, still showed up every day with a smile, still worked with pride, and still gave everything he had to ensure the school was taken care of. Barron didn't know why this particular scene stuck with him, but it did. He began to think about Ronald more and more, about the sacrifices he must have made, the challenges he must have faced. It was clear that life hadn't been easy for Ronald. He had lost his wife to cancer years ago and had been left to raise their 2 children alone. He worked long hours, often juggling multiple jobs, just to keep food on the table and a roof over his family's head. And yet, despite all of this, Ronald never seemed bitter or resentful. He didn't complain about his circumstances or seek sympathy from others. He simply kept going, day after day, for his children. Barron found himself asking more questions about Ronald. Why was he still driving that old car? Why didn't he get something more reliable, something that didn't require constant repairs? And how did he keep showing up every day with that same warm smile, that same quiet kindness, despite the struggles he faced outside of school? Barron couldn't help but admire him, and the more he observed, the more he felt an overwhelming desire to help. One day, after several weeks of quietly watching Ronald, Barron worked up the courage to approach him. It wasn't easy for Barron. He was the kind of person who wasn't used to striking up conversations with people outside of his usual circle. But he had to know more. He had to learn about this man who had touched his life in ways that others probably never even noticed. Barron caught Ronald by the lockers one afternoon, fixing a broken hinge that no one else seemed to notice. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then finally spoke up. "Hey, Mr. James," he said quietly. "Need a hand?" Ronald looked up, surprised, but smiled warmly at the gesture. "Well, hello there, young man. I think I've got it, but I appreciate the offer." His voice was kind, and his expression was genuine. Barron lingered, watching him finish the repair, and after a brief silence, he spoke again. "You're always fixing things," he said. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Ronald chuckled, a deep, rich laugh that seemed to carry the weight of his years. "Oh, sure. But someone's got to do it right. Besides, there's something satisfying about making things work again." Barron thought about that for a moment. There was something comforting in Ronald's words, something that made Barron realize just how much this man had given up in his life. Ronald wasn't just a janitor. He was a father, a caretaker, a mentor. He was someone who, despite his own struggles, still took the time to make the lives of others better, to do his part without asking for anything in return. And Barron admired that more than he could express. From that day on, Barron found himself thinking about Ronald more and more. He learned about Ronald's children, how his son dreamed of becoming a mechanical engineer, and how his daughter wanted to be a teacher. He heard stories about Ronald's late wife, the love of his life, and how her death had shaped him into the man he was today. But through it all, there was one thing that remained constant. Ronald never complained. He never talked about the struggles he faced in his personal life. He simply worked hard, kept his head down, and did what needed to be done. It was during one of these conversations that Barron finally asked a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Mr. James," he began hesitantly, "why don't you get a new car? That one looks like it's ready to give up on you." Ronald chuckled, shaking his head. "A new car, huh? Well, those things cost money, Barron. And money is something I don't have a lot of. Besides, as long as it gets me where I need to go, it's good enough for me." But Barron couldn't shake the thought. The more he learned about Ronald's life, the more he realized that this man wasn't just a janitor. He was a hero. A quiet, unassuming hero who had never asked for anything but gave everything. And Barron wanted to help. He knew that he couldn't solve all of Ronald's problems, but he could do something to make his life a little easier. Maybe, just maybe, he could give back to the man who had given so much to others. As the weeks went by, Barron's desire to help Ronald only grew stronger. He couldn't stop thinking about the sacrifices Ronald had made, about how his life had been shaped by hardship and loss, and about how he never once expected anything in return. Barron knew that he needed to do something, to show Ronald that he was seen, that his quiet kindness had not gone unnoticed. And so, Barron began to come up with a plan, one that he hoped would change Ronald's life forever. Barron knew that what he wanted to do for Ronald James was a huge undertaking, one that would require more than just his own effort. He couldn't solve everything for Ronald, but one thing he could do was help make his life a little easier. The old sedan that Ronald drove every day had been on its last legs for some time now, and Barron couldn't shake the thought that Ronald deserved something better. A car that wouldn't break down every other week. A car that he wouldn't have to fix himself just to get to work every morning. Barron knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. He had already decided that he wanted to buy Ronald a new car, something reliable, something that wouldn't make him worry every time he turned the ignition key. The idea seemed so simple at first, but as he thought about it more, the reality of the situation hit him. How was he supposed to pay for a car? He was just a high school student, with no real money to his name. Even if he worked part-time, the cost of a car, especially a new one, was far beyond what he could afford. But Barron wasn't the kind of person to give up so easily. He had a plan. And like any good plan, it required more than just his own effort. It needed the help of others. One evening at dinner, Barron nervously broached the subject with his parents. He had been thinking about it for days, turning it over in his mind. His parents were good people, kind-hearted and generous, but he knew this was going to be a big ask. Still, he had to try. He had to find a way to make this happen. As he pushed his food around on his plate, he finally spoke up. "You know Mr. James, the janitor at school?" His mother nodded, glancing at him curiously. "Yes, I know who you mean. The one who always greets you with a smile, even when he looks tired." Barron nodded, encouraged by the recognition. "I want to help him," he said quietly. "I want to get him a new car." His parents exchanged a glance, one that carried a mixture of surprise and concern. Barron's father, a practical man, leaned back in his chair and took a moment to consider the request. "A new car, son? That's a big gesture. Do you have any idea how much something like that would cost?" "I know it's a lot of money," Barron replied, his voice steady. "But Mr. James works so hard for everyone at school. His car is falling apart, and he never asks for anything. I think he deserves better." His mother studied him for a moment before speaking. "You're right, Barron. Mr. James does a lot for the school. But this isn't a small favor. It's a big gift, and you're going to need more than just your savings to pull this off." Barron was undeterred. "I'll figure it out. I know it won't be easy, but I really want to help him." His father sighed, clearly torn. "It's not that I don't understand, son. I do. But this isn't something we can just go out and do on a whim. You'll need to plan carefully. It's a lot of money, and you're going to have to figure out how to raise it." Barron's heart sank a little. He had hoped his parents would be more enthusiastic, but he understood their hesitation. This was a huge task, one that seemed impossible for a teenager to accomplish. But Barron was nothing if not determined. He wasn't going to let go of this idea. As the days passed, Barron began to think more seriously about how he could make his plan a reality. He started by talking to a few of his friends. He trusted them, and he knew they cared about Mr. James. So, at lunch one day, he gathered them together and shared his idea. "You guys know Mr. James, right?" Barron began, keeping his voice low so no one could overhear. "Yeah," one of his friends replied. "The janitor. He's always friendly, right?" Barron nodded. "Exactly. He's always there for us, making sure the school is clean and everything works. But he's driving this old car that barely runs. It's falling apart, and he can't afford a new one. I want to get him one, something reliable, something he doesn't have to fix every week." The group fell silent for a moment, processing the idea. Then, one of his friends spoke up. "That's a huge thing to do for someone. How are we supposed to pay for it?" Barron was ready for this question. "I'm not asking for much from anyone. I don't need anyone to pay for the whole car. If everyone can just pitch in a little bit, we can make it happen. I know it's a lot, but if we all help, we can do it." The others exchanged glances. They seemed unsure at first, but then one of his friends, a girl named Ella, spoke up. "I think it's a great idea. Mr. James deserves something for everything he does. He's always helping people without asking for anything. I'll pitch in." Slowly, one by one, the others agreed to help. They weren't able to donate large sums of money, but they were willing to give what they could. It was a start, and Barron was thrilled. The word started to spread quietly, and soon other students and teachers were on board. Teachers who had worked with Ronald for years appreciated his quiet dedication and agreed to help with the cause. Some of the teachers donated money outright, while others promised to pass the word along to their friends and family members. Barron had started a small movement, and it was growing. The more he spoke about Ronald's quiet kindness, the more people wanted to contribute. By the end of the week, Barron had raised several $100s. It wasn't enough for a car, but it was a good start. That's when Barron's parents stepped in. His father had contacted a local car dealership, explaining the situation and sharing Ronald's story. The dealership manager, moved by the kindness of the students and their willingness to help, offered to sell Barron a brand-new red Jeep SUV at a significant discount. It wasn't the most expensive model, but it was reliable, and it was a far cry from the old, broken-down sedan that Ronald had been driving. "We'll cover the rest of the cost," Barron's father had told the dealership. "You just focus on making this special for him." Barron's heart soared when he heard the news. The car was secured, but there was still so much more to do. Barron knew that presenting the car to Ronald needed to be more than just a simple gift. He wanted it to be an experience, a moment that Ronald would never forget. He wanted to show Ronald how much his kindness had meant to the school and how much he was appreciated by everyone. Barron began to brainstorm with his friends and teachers about how to make the reveal special. After some discussions, They decided to plan a surprise presentation during the upcoming school assembly. Everyone would be there: students, staff, teachers, and it would be the perfect opportunity to celebrate Ronald's hard work and dedication. The preparations kicked into high gear. Students created a large banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. James," and decorated it with messages of gratitude. Teachers worked behind the scenes to coordinate the logistics and ensure that Ronald wouldn't suspect anything. The goal was to make the reveal as seamless and surprising as possible. Barron practiced his speech late into the night, pacing around his room and rehearsing the words he hoped would express just how much Ronald meant to the school. He wanted his speech to be heartfelt and genuine. Ronald wasn't just a janitor, he was a mentor, a figure of quiet strength who had touched so many lives with his kindness. Barron wasn't just giving him a car, he was giving him a moment of recognition, a chance to be celebrated for everything he had done for the school. By the time Friday rolled around, the excitement at Oxbridge Academy was palpable. Students whispered about the surprise in the hallways, eager to see the plan come together. Everyone seemed to know that something big was coming, but no one knew exactly what it was. Teachers, too, were getting excited, sharing their own stories of how Ronald had gone above and beyond for the school. Barron could feel the energy building, and he knew the moment of truth was just around the corner. He had done everything he could to make this special. But now it was time for the assembly. The moment that would change Ronald's life forever. The school was buzzing with anticipation, and Barron's heart raced in his chest as he prepared to take the stage. He knew this wasn't just about a car. It was about showing Ronald that his kindness had not gone unnoticed. And that was something worth celebrating. The morning of the assembly arrived, and the atmosphere at Oxbridge Academy felt electric. The students, normally scattered across classrooms, had gathered in the auditorium, buzzing with excitement. Conversations were hushed, whispers of something big happening, but no one knew exactly what. Everyone was eager to see what the assembly was about, and though the excitement was palpable, there was a sense of mystery in the air. Barron stood backstage, his heart racing in anticipation. He had practiced his speech countless times, but now, with the moment just minutes away, he couldn't help but feel the nerves building. Barron glanced out through the curtains, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The auditorium was packed, with the students seated in neat rows, eagerly awaiting whatever was about to unfold. At the back of the room, Ronald James had quietly entered and taken his usual seat, blending in with the crowd. He was unaware of what was to come. For him, today was just another day at the school he had served for years, mopping the floors, fixing the broken lockers, making sure everything was in its place. He had no idea that today, everything was about to change. Barron stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. He spotted his friends, some of whom had helped raise the money for the car, sitting in the front rows, exchanging excited glances. Teachers were scattered throughout the crowd, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and excitement. Barron could see the anticipation building in the room. It wasn't just about the car. It was about something bigger, showing Ronald that his quiet acts of kindness had not gone unnoticed, that the sacrifices he made every day had meant something to everyone around him. Finally, the assembly began. The headmaster stepped onto the stage, greeted by applause from the students and staff. He welcomed everyone with his usual warmth, speaking briefly about the importance of community and the value of working together. It was an ordinary introduction to an ordinary assembly, but there was something in the air that made this moment feel different. Ronald, seated near the back, seemed lost in the familiar rhythm of the event, unaware of the surprise that was waiting for him. The headmaster's words faded into the background as Barron prepared himself to step into the spotlight. He knew this wasn't just about the car. It was about honoring Ronald in a way that would show him how much he was appreciated. He had rehearsed his speech over and over again. But now that the moment was here, everything felt even more important than he had imagined. As the headmaster finished his introduction, Barron's cue arrived. He stepped forward, holding a stack of note cards in his hands, though he wasn't sure he even needed them anymore. "Good morning, everyone," Barron began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, but instead of feeling nervous, he felt a surge of purpose. This was a moment that mattered. "I'm here today because there's someone at this school who deserves recognition," he continued. "Someone who makes this place better every single day." A murmur rippled through the room. Students shifted in their seats, intrigued by Barron's words. Ronald, who had been sitting quietly, turned his head slightly. His curiosity piqued. He had no idea where this was going. Barron paused, his eyes scanning the room, before he said the words that would forever change Ronald's life. "I'm talking about Mr. James." The entire room erupted in applause. The sound was deafening. Ronald's body stiffened in surprise. His eyes widened as he glanced around, his mind racing. Barron was talking about him. This was about him. But why? He had never expected anything like this. He had always worked quietly in the background, never asking for recognition, never expecting to be in the spotlight. The applause continued, and Ronald was frozen in place, unsure of how to process what was happening. Barron smiled at the response, waiting for the noise to die down before he spoke again. "Mr. James isn't just our janitor," he continued. "He's the guy who shows up every morning to make sure our classrooms are spotless, our hallways are clean, and our school feels like home. He's the guy who fixes what's broken, whether it's a locker, a leaky faucet, or even our spirits when we're having a bad day." Ronald's heart swelled. He had always worked with pride, but he had never imagined that his efforts could mean so much to anyone else. It was overwhelming to hear someone acknowledge his work so openly. He had never asked for thanks. All he wanted was to do his job well, to make the school a better place for the students, for the teachers. But hearing Barron's words, seeing the room full of people applauding him, was more than he could have ever imagined. The lights in the auditorium dimmed slightly, and a video began to play on the large screen behind Barron. It was a montage of clips and photos, showing Ronald at work, mopping floors, repairing broken furniture, fixing lockers, and carrying supplies. The video was interspersed with interviews from students and staff members, each person sharing their own thoughts on how Ronald had touched their lives. "He always has a smile for you," one student said, her voice filled with affection. "He never complains, even when we make his job harder." Another student spoke up. "I remember when my backpack got lost, and Mr. James stayed late to help me find it. He didn't have to, but he did." The room was filled with warmth as people shared their experiences, their gratitude for the janitor who had made their days brighter without ever asking for anything in return. Ronald couldn't hold back his tears any longer. He wiped his eyes quickly, but it was no use. The tears kept coming, and the realization of how much his presence in the school mattered hit him all at once. When the video ended, the entire auditorium stood up, clapping and cheering. Barron stepped forward again, holding something in his hand. "Mr. James," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "we know you never ask for anything, but we see you. We see how hard you work, how much you care, and how you give so much of yourself to this school. Today, we want to give something back to you." The side doors of the stage opened, and a gleaming red Jeep SUV was revealed, parked under a large banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. James." The car gleamed in the spotlight, its bright red paint a stark contrast to the battered old sedan that Ronald had driven every day. The crowd erupted into cheers once again, and Ronald's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe his eyes. This was for him? His hands trembled as he tried to process the enormity of the gesture. The car, the recognition. It was all too much. Barron smiled at Ronald, holding out the keys to the new car. "This is for you," he said, his voice filled with pride. "From all of us." Ronald stood up slowly, still in shock. He could barely move, his legs shaking. The applause was deafening, but he couldn't focus on the sound. His eyes were fixed on the car, on the shiny red SUV that was now his. His heart swelled with a mix of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and a profound sense of being seen. He had never imagined something like this would happen. A teacher gently placed a hand on Ronald's shoulder, urging him to walk toward the stage. His legs wobbled as he took slow, hesitant steps, and as he reached the stage, Barron handed him the keys to the car. Ronald stood there for a moment, staring at the keys, unable to find the words. His voice trembled as he finally spoke, though it was barely audible over the applause. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "You didn't have to do this. I just do my job." But Barron, standing beside him, shook his head. "It's not just about the car, Mr. James," he said softly. "It's about everything you've done for us. You've touched so many lives, and this is our way of saying thank you." Ronald's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't just tears of surprise. They were tears of gratitude, of being recognized for something he had always done quietly. He looked out at the audience, the students, the teachers, the staff, who had come together to make this moment happen. This wasn't just about a car. It was about showing him that his work had mattered, that his kindness had made a difference. The applause continued, but Ronald raised a hand to silence it. I've always believed," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "that kindness isn't something you do for recognition. It's something you do because it's the right thing to do. I've tried to live my life that way, and to see all of you come together like this, it means more than I can ever put into words." Another round of applause erupted, and this time Ronald allowed himself to smile through the tears. He took a deep breath, his voice growing steadier as he continued. "When my wife passed away, I didn't think I'd ever feel this kind of joy again. But I had 2 kids to raise, and I had to keep going. They were my reason for everything. And now, because of all of you, I can give them a little more. I can take them places. I can get to work without worrying if my car will break down on me." Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't care. He finally allowed himself to feel the weight of this incredible moment. And as he looked out at the faces of the students, teachers, and staff who had made this moment possible, he realized that this wasn't just about a car. It was about community, about coming together to support one another, to lift each other up in ways that no one could have anticipated. "Mr. James," Barron said quietly, "we see you, and we appreciate you." With those words, Barron pulled Ronald into a tight hug, and the crowd erupted into applause once more. It was a moment that would change both of their lives forever. Ronald stepped back from the hug, turning to face the crowd. "I just want to say," he began, his voice full of emotion, "thank you. Thank you to everyone who made this possible. You've reminded me of something I almost forgot, that no matter how tough life gets, there are always people who care. There's always good in the world. And as the applause filled the auditorium, Ronald realized that kindness, no matter how small or unrecognized, had the power to change lives. It wasn't just about the car. It was about the ripple effect of one simple act of generosity, one gesture of recognition. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The day wasn't over yet, but as he stood on that stage, surrounded by his children and the people he had come to love and respect, Ronald knew that this was a moment he would never forget. His work, his kindness, and his sacrifices had not gone unnoticed. And in that moment, he was reminded that even the smallest acts of kindness could lead to extraordinary moments.